On the day the prison gates finally opened, after 26 years of concrete, steel, and dust, an old man in a simple suit stepped into the blinding Cape Town sun. Cameras clicked, politicians smiled, children lifted homemade posters with his name. But in Raymond Mhlaba's head, the clock was ticking, not forward into freedom, backward. Every second of that triumphant walk was chained to something that had happened decades earlier. A farm boy, watching his world being stolen in silence. A young worker racing against time to outsmart bosses and police. A political organizer fighting not only a murderous regime, but another black movement trying to win the same desperate hearts. His real battle had started long before the world knew his name, long before the word hero was ever whispered. To understand the man who would someday help bury apartheid, you have to start where he had almost no power at all. You have to start in the dust. He was born on 12th of February 1920 in the rural Eastern Cape of South Africa near Fort Beaufort, in a landscape of wide skies and thin soil. His people worked land they did not own, under laws they had never agreed to. Cows were counted every evening the way children should have been. By the time little Raymond could walk, he already belonged to a country that had decided what he was worth, less than a white man's shadow. His father died while Raymond was still young. His mother struggled to hold the family together, clinging to a fragile dignity in a system designed to strip it away. Nights in the Rondavelle were cold. The wind found every crack in the mud walls. But there was always one warm, stubborn thing in that house: the insistence that this boy would learn. Books, they whispered, were a kind of weapon. Picture that child, bare feet, patched shorts, walking miles along a dusty road to a mission school, clutching a slate and a stub of chalk. The building itself was small, wooden, nothing special, but to him, it might as well have been a cathedral. For the first time, letters began to dance into words, words into sentences, sentences into ideas that reached beyond the hills that fenced in his village. And then came the first cruel twist of his life. While he learned about justice and liberty in English primers, he watched injustice march in through the front door. One day, a white official arrived on horseback, papers in hand, to announce that yet another piece of African land had been reclassified, fenced off, taken. Men who had plowed fields for years were now squatters. Women who had buried their children in that soil were now trespassers on their own memories. The boy listened as his elders pleaded, their voices shaking, but never raised. The official didn't even dismount. In that moment, something split inside him. The gentle mission teachings about patience collided with the raw violence of reality. The words in his schoolbooks were beautiful. The world outside those pages was brutal. He learned a second lesson that day: silence protected no one. As he grew into a teenager, Raymond's world stretched. He tended a well-known mission school, Healdtown, a place that produced teachers, preachers, and quietly, future rebels. In crowded dormitories, boys argued in whispers about politics they barely understood. Names like African National Congress drifted through the corridors like contraband. Senior pupils passed around crumpled newspapers, hiding them under blankets when footsteps approached. He absorbed everything. The curriculum wanted him to learn obedience and scripture. But the chemistry that really mattered was happening in his mind, the slow reaction between humiliation and hope. Still, poverty was a patient enemy. School fees, uniforms, books, they all demanded money his family didn't have. Eventually, the system nudged him where it wanted most black boys to go, away from classrooms toward cheap labor. He left school before his hunger for learning was satisfied, carrying with him a neat handwriting, a sharp memory, and a growing anger that refused to be buried. He went where so many young men from the countryside went, the city, Port Elizabeth. Early 1940s. The harbor cranes clawed at the sky. Factories belched smoke. Trains screamed into stations, dragging behind them wagons of coal, wheat, weapons, and people. The city was alive, but it was not his. The best streets, the green parks, the clean benches, all reserved for others. He found work at a laundry, one of the jobs that swallowed black men and spat out old bodies. Inside, steam turned the air into a choking fog. Shirts, sheets, uniforms, mountains of them, moved along like an endless white river. The workers' hands were red and raw. Burns and blisters were as common as their names. Here, the promise of wages came with a slap of reality. Long hours, low pay, no rights. The boss could fire a man for looking tired. The factory whistle was the only clock that mattered. But there was another clock ticking, and only a few could hear it. News from Europe bled into the townships. Hitler, fascism, war. The same government that treated black South Africans as cheap labor was now calling for unity against tyranny overseas. Men who could not vote in their own country were being sent to fight for freedom in places they couldn't find on a map. In the laundry's changing room, workers argued over newspapers, passing them from hand to hand, the ink staining their fingers. Raymond listened more than he spoke. He watched who complained, who stayed silent, who looked over their shoulder before daring to say a word. He learned another useful skill, how to count the brave. Slowly, he began to take small risks. He stood up for co-workers when wages were docked unfairly. He insisted on talking back when a supervisor shouted. At first, it was just stubbornness, something that had always been there. But stubbornness, in that time and place, was a gateway drug to politics. Soon, he was more than just another worker. He was a problem. Union organizers noticed the tall, serious young man who could listen for hours and then summarize a problem in one calm sentence. They pushed pamphlets into his hands, invited him to secret meetings. There, in smoke-filled rooms behind shebeens and in cramped township kitchens, he heard a name repeated with a kind of quiet reverence. African National Congress. The ANC was old, older than he was, but in those years it was waking up, shaken by younger voices demanding that polite petitions were not enough. They spoke about mass action, about ordinary people refusing to obey unjust laws. Some were impatient, others cautious, but they all agreed on one thing. The way things were could not continue. In 1942, Raymond joined them. It was a simple act on paper, filling in a membership, paying a small fee, but it felt like crossing an invisible line. He was no longer just victim. He was part of a force, however small, pushing back. A line now ran clearly through his life, before the ANC and after. One choice pulled another. In 1943, he took another step that would shape his future. He joined the South African Communist Party. For a young man who had watched employers grow rich off workers' broken hands, the language of class and exploitation made sense. Here was a framework that explained why his family's land had been taken, why his school had been cut short, why the laundry floor was always full of black bodies, and the office always full of white ones. His nights grew longer. After grueling shifts, he would sit in meetings lit by paraffin lamps, listening to debates about Marx, about democracy, about revolution. As others yawned, he leaned forward. Ideas, finally, were as real and urgent as the ironing boards and boilers of his day job. But as one part of him was nourished, another part began to feel the strain. The more he committed to politics, the more dangerous his life became. The police knew that unions and the ANC were breeding grounds for troublemakers. Informers lurked in taverns and at bus stops, ears sharpened for words like strike and boycott. And in the townships, another, quieter tension began to stir. Competition. The ANC did not fight alone. Other groups, other leaders, believed they had the better path for black liberation. They argued about tactics, about alliances, about how far to trust whites, about whether working with communists was a betrayal or a necessity. In cramped meeting halls, rival speakers tried to outshout each other, each claiming to speak for the people. Raymond learned to see politics not only as a struggle between oppressed and oppressor, but also as a contest within the oppressed camp itself. Who would lead? Which vision would win? The fight against apartheid was already a race, and not everyone was running in the same direction. By the early 1950s, time itself became a weapon. The National Party government, elected on an explicit promise of apartheid, moved with ruthless efficiency. Each year brought new laws, pass laws tightening, land acts hardening, segregation taking firmer root. Each session of Parliament felt like a countdown to another blow. Inside the ANC, one thought drove everything. If they did not move now, if they did not show ordinary people their strength, the space for legal resistance would close forever. In 1952, the Defiance Campaign was born, a coordinated national plan to deliberately and openly break apartheid laws. Volunteers would enter whites-only waiting rooms, ride in whites-only train carriages, walk through whites-only doorways, and when arrested, they would refuse bail. The goal was simple and impossibly ambitious: flood the jails, expose the cruelty of the system, force the world to look. In Port Elizabeth, one of the most important hubs of the campaign, a name rose to the surface: Raymond Mhlaba. He was now in his early 30s, with a calm face that hid a volcanic determination. He had earned respect in unions and in party meetings. People trusted that when he spoke, it was because he had listened first. Leaders needed someone like that to coordinate action in the Eastern Cape's industrial heart. There was a clock over his head again. The campaign needed to launch on a fixed date, with maximum impact. That meant recruiting volunteers, printing leaflets, organizing secret briefings, all while the police grew more suspicious and informers more active. Every day lost was a day the government could use to tighten its net, to preempt the action with arrests and bans. He walked through townships with a mental stopwatch ticking. Knock on this door. Explain the plan. Calm the fears. Move to the next house. Convince one more worker, one more teacher, one more domestic worker willing to risk their job, their safety, maybe their life. And there was another pressure, a more personal, painful one. In smoky backyards and crowded community halls, Raymond found himself facing not only fear, but competition from a different kind of leader. The firebrand who promised quicker, purer victory. Younger activists, impatient with what they saw as the ANC's cautious pace and compromises, began to speak of forming new, more radical organizations built on a different philosophy of Africa for Africans. They had a point. People were tired of petitions, tired of polite disappointment. They wanted something that felt like action, like pride. Their words crackled with anger, and anger in a crushed community is dangerously attractive. Raymond's fight wasn't just against the state anymore. It was against time and against a rival vision of freedom that threatened to split the movement he had given his life to. On the day the Defiance Campaign was to begin in Port Elizabeth, the tension was like a storm about to break. Volunteers gathered in small groups, hearts pounding. Some had barely slept, replaying worst-case scenarios in their minds. Beatings, bullets, years stolen in jail. Others felt a strange calm, as if they were finally stepping into the role history had written for them. Raymond walked at the front of one group, heading for a whites-only railway booking office. He was dressed neatly, as if for church. The only difference was the knowledge that each step might be leading him toward a cell. Police watched from a distance, their eyes cold, their notebooks ready. He crossed the invisible line, into the wrong door, into the wrong space, and in that simple act, he proclaimed a truth the law denied. He was as human as any man in that room. The arrest came quickly, almost clinically, hands on shoulders, a voice reciting charges, contravening unjust laws, disturbing an unjust peace. Behind him, other volunteers were also being taken. Somewhere, a train whistle screamed, the ordinary sounds of the city swallowing the extraordinary courage of what was happening. In the cells, time did something strange. The man who had raced against deadlines, against parliamentary sessions, against the pull of rival movements, was suddenly trapped in hours that would not move. Walls have no calendars. Bars do not understand urgency. Yet even there, the rivalry that defined his political life did not disappear. News filtered in, carried by new prisoners and smuggled letters. The campaign had shaken the country. The ANC had grown in stature and membership. But murmurs of division also grew louder. Different currents in the struggle were pulling in different directions, sharpening their arguments, polishing their own visions of leadership. From his narrow bunk, Raymond understood that the fight was entering a new phase. The enemy in uniform was still out there, tightening its grip. Inside the broader liberation movement, a different struggle for hearts, minds, and strategy was accelerating. His time in that first prison cell would end. The sentence, 9 months, much of it with hard labor, would eventually be completed. The door would open, and he would step back into a country that had moved on without him, even as it had changed because of men like him. But as he listened to the echo of footsteps in the corridor and felt the roughness of the concrete under his fingers, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The clock had not stopped. It was only just starting to race. The strangest thing about freedom is how quickly it can feel like a trap. When Raymond Mhlaba walked out after that first 9-month sentence, people in Port Elizabeth called him brave, comrade, the one who went first into the whites-only door. But the moment the cells slammed behind him, the government had already turned his courage into a file number. From then on, every step he took was under a quiet spotlight. Every meeting he attended was a line in a police report. He wasn't just free, he was being watched. He returned to a city that had changed in small, poisonous ways. New signs, new regulations, new police patrols, all sharpening the lines between white and black. The Defiance campaign had shaken the regime, but it had also taught them they were learning how to crush, more efficiently, more surgically. In the townships, though, something electric lingered. People spoke his name with a kind of rough pride. Women pointed him out to their children at bus stops. Men nodded as he passed, not like they would to a local shopkeeper, but like they would to someone who had stepped over an invisible edge on their behalf. He could have used that respect to step back, to live a quieter life. He chose the opposite. He plunged deeper into organizing. Now, when workers met in back rooms and church halls, he wasn't just the thoughtful young man at the edge of the crowd. He was at the center, chairing meetings, calming tempers, holding together people who were one insult away from tearing each other apart. In 1950s Port Elizabeth, he rose to become a leading figure in the ANC, the man you called when a strike needed discipline, when a march needed direction. But leadership in those years came with a countdown. The National Party's vision of apartheid was hardening. In March 1960, police opened fire on unarmed protesters in a dusty township called Sharpeville, killing 69 people and wounding hundreds. The images of bodies on the ground, of men shot in the back as they fled, exploded across the world. Inside South Africa, the gunshots at Sharpeville did something else. They started a race. On one side was the ANC, with its long history, its connections, its cautious strategy of mass defiance and alliances. On the other was a younger, sharper force that had broken away in anger, calling the ANC too soft, too compromised, too willing to share platforms with white communists and Indian activists. They called themselves the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAS, and in township streets, their slogans burned. Africa for Africans. You can't ask your oppressor for freedom. You take it. In shebeens and on street corners, arguments flared. Old comrades found themselves on opposite sides of bitter debates. Young men who had once carried ANC pamphlets now waved PAC leaflets, drawn by the promise of an unfiltered, uncompromising black nationalism. For Raymond, the rivalry was not abstract. He could see it, count it, measure it in faces. One of the loudest PAC voices in Port Elizabeth belonged to a man named Thabo. Tall, charismatic, quick with a joke that turned into a knife. He had once stood on ANC platforms, handing out leaflets that Raymond had helped write. Now he stood across the road from Raymond's meetings, gathering his own crowd, his own storm. They debated late into the night, in cramped kitchens, where the smell of paraffin mixed with anger. Thabo accused the ANC of hiding behind big words, of waiting for a miracle from the United Nations, of trusting white communists who would never truly bleed for Africa. Raymond fired back that slogans alone would not defeat a regime that controlled the army, the courts, the economy, that the struggle needed discipline, alliances, strategy. Underneath the words, another, harsher truth pressed in. Whoever convinced the youth now would shape the future. The regime, watching from its offices and squad cars, understood this too. Let the oppressed fight among themselves, and the clock buys you time. Sharpeville gave the government the excuse it wanted. Within weeks, both the ANC and the PAC were banned. Offices were raided, typewriters were seized, leaders were detained without trial, beaten, interrogated, released, rearrested. Legal politics collapsed almost overnight. For Raymond, the ban was both a tragedy and a twisted liberation. On paper, his organization no longer existed. In reality, it was being forced down into the soil, into an underground life of code names, safe houses, whispered plans. The struggle was becoming invisible, and invisibility came with a new set of rules. He lived now as a man divided. By day, he did what he could to appear ordinary, moving between small jobs, keeping his head just low enough. By night, he moved through rooms that were never used twice, meeting with other activists whose faces he had known for years, and yet now had to greet as if for the first time. The questions in those rooms were sharper than ever. If peaceful protest brought bullets and banning, what was left? How long could you ask people to walk into police batons with empty hands? In 1961, as the apartheid government paraded South Africa as a new republic, cutting formal ties with the British Crown, a different kind of declaration was being drafted in the shadows. Underground ANC leaders, many of them also communists, argued that the movement needed an armed wing, not to replace political struggle, but to support it, to demonstrate that there would be a cost for oppression. Raymond was in the thick of those debates. He was not a man of dramatic speeches. He listened, asked precise questions, weighed risks, but he understood one thing with painful clarity. Time was not on their side. Each year that passed, apartheid dug deeper roots. Each law that went unchallenged became a new normal. If they did nothing, they were not being peaceful. They were surrendering. When the decision was finally taken to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, known as MK, he did not watch from the sidelines. He stepped forward. He became one of its regional commanders in the Eastern Cape. Now the clock wasn't just political. It was explosive. Safe houses turned into workshops. Radios hissed late into the night, receiving instructions, sending reports. Ordinary objects, alarm clocks, batteries, fertilizer, became parts of devices that, if miswired, could erase a man's hands or his life in a single second. Young recruits arrived with fear and excitement in their eyes, expecting guns and glory. Instead, Raymond drilled into them a colder, harder discipline. Study, patience, targets chosen to avoid loss of life. The first MK actions were small, careful. Sabotage, power pylons blown, telephone lines cut, empty government offices damaged. The message was clear. Apartheid was not invincible, not untouchable. The state responded with fury. Raids intensified. New laws widened the police's power to detain without trial. Inside the movement, whispers of betrayal grew. Someone, somewhere, was talking. Time, again, was running out. In late 1962, Raymond left South Africa for the first time in his life, part of a group of activists sent abroad for military training. They flew from the scrublands of the Eastern Cape into a different world, cities of neon and concrete in countries that spoke of people's war and liberation. In training camps, he learned the theory and practice of guerrilla struggle, how to plan actions that hurt systems, not civilians, how to keep discipline when anger screamed for revenge. But even in foreign barracks, he was not free of rivalry. Reports reached them of the Parsi trying to build its own armed presence, of competing appeals for international support. At every conference, every secret meeting with potential allies, there was the same question: which movement truly represented the oppressed of South Africa? For Raymond, the competition wasn't a sporting rivalry. It was a constant headache, a perpetual risk. A divided liberation movement made it easier for the regime to paint them all as dangerous extremists. And yet, he could not simply wish the other organizations away. They were real, they were passionate, and they carried the hopes of thousands. When he returned to South Africa in 1963, slipping back across borders under false names and careful routes, he knew that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. The security police were better trained, better informed, more ruthless. Every meeting of the underground leadership was a potential trap. One farmhouse, at a place called Liliesleaf, outside Johannesburg, became a critical nerve center. There, in what looked like a quiet piece of countryside, some of the most wanted men in the country gathered to plan the next phase of resistance. Papers were spread out on tables. Maps were marked. The future of the struggle was sketched in pencil lines and cigarette smoke. On 11 July 1963, the clock hit 0. Police and security forces stormed Liliesleaf with a precision that made it clear they had been watching, listening, waiting. Files were grabbed, documents seized, men arrested before they could even process the sound of boots on gravel. Among them, Nelson Mandela, already in prison on another case, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Raymond Mhlaba. The regime called it a breakthrough. The movement called it a disaster. For Raymond, there was a brief, bitterly human thought. Had the rivalries been worth it? Had the arguments, the splits, the different banners won them anything, now that they all faced the same steel door? The Rivonia trial that followed was more than a criminal case. It was a staged confrontation between an aging, frightened regime and a group of leaders who had decided that if they were going to lose their freedom, they might as well use the dock as a platform. The charges were brutal: sabotage, conspiracy, attempts to overthrow the state, links to foreign powers. The maximum sentence was not years, it was death. Time in that courtroom was a torture of its own. Days of evidence, weeks of arguments, months of uncertainty. Outside, the world was changing. Protests flared in cities across the globe. International campaigns demanded their release. Inside, the accused sat in a line, listening to experts testify about explosives, fingerprints, documents, as if their lives were simply technical problems to be solved. The rivalry within the liberation camp did not vanish. PAC prisoners elsewhere grumbled that all the attention was on the ANC accused in Rivonia, that history was being written with one set of initials. In some townships, whispered "I told you so's" floated. If the ANC had been more careful, less open to communists, would they have been caught? But in that courtroom, facing a judge who could sentence them to hang, Raymond and his comrades had to put every division aside. The real question was simple. How do you die, if you must die, in a way that strengthens the cause instead of weakening it? When it was his turn to speak, Raymond did not deliver a dramatic, headline-grabbing speech like Mandela. That was not his way. He spoke calmly, firmly, explaining why a man raised in the dust of dispossession, worked to the bone in white-owned factories, banned and arrested for asking for equality, might decide that the law had no moral hold over him. He did not beg. He did not apologize. Then came the day of sentencing. For hours, the judge read through a long, cold summary of the case. The courtroom seemed held in one breath. Outside, people pressed against barriers, waiting for a sound, a sign, anything. International observers sat with pens poised above notepads, ready to write death or life in ink that would travel across oceans. On the counts of sabotage, the judge intoned, the words that followed stunned even the accused. Life imprisonment, not death. Still, the twist cut both ways. Their bodies would survive, but they would survive in a living tomb. Robben Island, a prison carved into rock and surrounded by freezing sea, a place designed not just to hold men, but to erase them. As he was led away, chains on his wrists, Raymond understood the new shape of his race against time. He would not be fighting the regime in streets or courtrooms. He would be fighting it behind walls, with his aging body as the clock. Would he live long enough to see freedom? Would the movement hold together long enough, outside, for his sacrifice to mean anything? On the boat to Robben Island, prisoners huddled against the wind as waves slammed the hull. Ahead, the outline of the island rose, low, hard, unforgiving. Around them, the sea stretched indifferent in every direction. In that moment, surrounded by comrades and yet entirely alone in his thoughts, one thing burned through Raymond's mind like a command. The struggle out there will be decided by the choices made in here, because even in prison, the rivalry continued. Different political groups, ANC, PAC, Black consciousness supporters, carved out their own corners, held their own classes, pushed their own strategies. Arguments about ideology would erupt in exercise yards as sharply as they had in township kitchens. Time on the island moved strangely. Days were broken by hard labor in the quarry, by routine, by the small humiliations of jailers who thought they were the masters of these men's fate. Seasons passed. Comrades grew old in front of each other's eyes. New prisoners arrived, bringing news of uprisings and crackdowns, of school children in Soweto facing bullets, of the world slowly turning against apartheid. From his narrow bed, Raymond listened to those reports with the same intense focus he had once given to underground meetings. He was still counting the brave, still weighing strategies, still measuring the distance between his people's suffering and their freedom. The world would later remember that he spent 26 years behind bars. What the world could not see was that all through those years, the competition for the soul of the struggle, the race against the regime's clock, never stopped. It simply moved into new battlegrounds, prison yards, smuggled letters, messages coded in family visits. And somewhere beyond the ocean, far from the salt-stung air of Robben Island, the future he could not yet touch was already gathering. Speed, a future in which the man now wearing prison overalls would be asked to exchange them for something even heavier. Power. Power was supposed to feel like a rival. For Raymond Mhlaba, it felt like waking up in a burning house with everyone shouting his name and handing him the smallest fire extinguisher. He stepped out of prison in November 1989 and into a country that looked familiar and alien at the same time. The same dust, the same townships, the same police vans cruising slow like hungry sharks. But the posters were different now. Faces of exiles he hadn't seen in decades smiled down from walls. Young people wore T-shirts with slogans that hadn't even existed when he went in. Portable cassette players blared songs that praised names like his as legends, martyrs, giants. He felt none of that. What he felt, as he blinked against the freedom of the open sky, was a weight he hadn't known even on Robben Island. Expectation. For years, people had whispered to each other in queues and crowded buses. When they come out, when Raymond and Mandela and the others come back, then things will change. Now he was here. The sentence was over. The myth was walking in the street in a worn suit, hugging strangers who cried when they touched him. Inside, a different clock started ticking. He was almost 70. His joints ached from years in the quarry. His lungs remembered the dust before his mind did. Every handshake hurt a little. How much time did a man like that have to help reshape a country that had been broken deliberately for half a century? And he wasn't stepping into a united battlefield. The rivalry he had left behind hadn't dissolved in his absence. It had multiplied. The pack had built its own networks, its own heroes. New currents like black consciousness had raised a generation that spoke of psychological liberation, of refusing any reconciliation with their oppressors. And now, as apartheid began to wobble, something even more dangerous emerged. Competition, not just between liberation movements and the regime, but between liberation movements themselves for the right to define what freedom would actually mean. One evening, in a cramped hall in Port Elizabeth, still smelling of old varnish and new sweat, he saw a ghost made flesh. Thabo, older now, lines at the corners of his eyes, hair flecked with grey, the same quick smile, the same voice that turned jokes into weapons. He was addressing a crowd of young activists, many of them born after Sharpeville, some of them infants when Rivonia happened. You waited, Thabo was saying, for men in prison to negotiate your future. You trusted that the same people who led you into sabotage will now sit in boardrooms with the generals and write a contract for your freedom. Ask yourselves, who benefits from compromise? The crowd murmured, angry and enthralled. Raymond watched from the side, his presence half hidden, his name rippling through the room like a rumor. Thabo's eyes met his for a heartbeat. No greeting, no nod, just recognition and challenge. The rivalry that had once been about whose leaflet was more convincing was now about something far bigger, whose vision would claim the souls of the youth and the future of a country on the edge of transformation or catastrophe. The rules had changed. So had the stakes. The apartheid state was not simply going to fall on its own. Inside polished boardrooms and shadowy security offices, men who had ordered torture and disappearances were now weighing a different calculation. Could they trade bullets for ballots and keep enough of their power to stay rich, safe, untouchable? Negotiations began as cold, stiff meetings between men who had spent years trying to destroy each other. The cameras showed handshakes. The transcripts spoke of frameworks and transitional arrangements. What they did not show was the fury just beneath the surface. In white eyes that had never expected to share a table with terrorists, in black eyes that had watched comrades die and now had to discuss constitutional clauses with the people who signed the orders, Raymond's role was not glamorous. He was not the headline negotiator, but in smoke-filled rooms and late-night strategy sessions inside ANC offices, his presence was like a weight on the table. He had spent longer than most in the belly of the regime's prison system. When younger comrades shouted that compromise was betrayal, that they should walk away unless every demand was met immediately, he listened without flinching, and then quietly asked the question that cut through romance. If we walk out and war follows, can we win it? With what? And how many of our people will die before we learn the answer? Time pressed from every side. The regime wanted a slow transition, hoping each month would weaken the movement, deepen divisions, drain energy. The movements wanted speed, but not chaos. In the townships, patience was vanishing. In some areas, violence had become a daily weather. Right-wing militias, state-backed hit squads, clashes between rival black groups, funerals turned into political rallies, and political rallies turned into target practice for unknown shooters. One brutal week in the early 1990s, more than 100 people died in political violence in the Eastern Cape alone. 100 bodies in 7 days, most of them young, most of them carrying someone's hope for a new country. In that storm, the rivalry with Thabo took on a sharper, crueler edge. He had become a force in a smaller radical party that condemned the negotiations as a sellout. In pamphlets and street corner speeches, his message was razor simple. No talks with killers. No seats at the table with thieves. The only real negotiation is on the battlefield. The youth, already armed with anger and often with real weapons, listened. Raymond understood the magnet of that message. He had felt the same rage decades earlier, but he had also spent 26 years watching men die slowly, cell by cell, and he knew what a full-blown civil war would look like in a country where one side still controlled the tanks and the Air Force. He used every ounce of respect he had to pull people back from that cliff. Town hall meetings turned into courtroom dramas. On one side, the argument for purity. On the other, the argument for survival. In some gatherings, it came down to this: an old man with a cracked voice trying to convince a room full of teenagers that the hardest thing they could do was not to kill, but to wait. The countdown to the first democratic election made everything more urgent. A date was set, April 27, 1994. A day that had existed in songs and dreams would now exist on calendars and posters. But to reach it without the country tearing itself apart required an almost impossible act, turning decades of rage into lines on a ballot paper. In those last, fevered months, Raymond's life became a blur of travel, meetings, and arguments. He moved across the Eastern Cape like a man trying to stitch a ripped cloth faster than it could tear. Former guerrillas, ex-political prisoners, old chiefs who had once collaborated with homeland governments, student leaders whose entire political education was the language of burn and boycott. He sat with all of them, listened to all of them, pushed them toward a single fragile idea: vote first, fight later if you must, but give peace one chance to prove you wrong. Election day came like a dream. Lines snaked from polling stations before dawn. Old women who had never been counted by their own government leaned on walking sticks for hours, refusing to leave even when rain came. Men who had carried guns now carried folded pieces of paper, and for the first time in their lives, a legal say. In the Eastern Cape, the turnout was astonishing. In some areas, more than 90% of eligible voters arrived. People walked kilometers on bare feet. One man, Raymond heard later, was carried by neighbors on a door ripped from its hinges because he was too sick to walk but had sworn he would vote before he died. The ANC won by a landslide. Nationally, the story that went around the world was simple. Nelson Mandela was president. Apartheid was over. Locally, another story unfolded. In a modest hall in Bisho, surrounded by plastic chairs and the mixed smell of sweat, cheap cologne, and photocopied documents, Raymond Mhlaba was chosen as the first premier of the new Eastern Cape province. It sounded grand. It wasn't. The territory he was now responsible for had been deliberately designed to fail. It stitched together pieces of the old Cape province with the shredded remains of the so-called independent homelands of Transkei and Ciskei, rural, neglected, underfunded, drowning in poverty and corruption left by puppet regimes. In some districts, 8 out of 10 households had no electricity. In others, children walked 10 kilometers to schools with no doors, no toilets, no textbooks. Clinics with peeling paint ran out of basic medicines for weeks. In one notorious hospital, rats were seen slipping under the beds of patients. This was the freedom dividend he was expected to deliver immediately. On a budget written in the ruins of apartheid economics and outside the government buildings, Thabo smiled in bitter satisfaction. He and others like him had not vanished with the votes. They were still there, organizing, pointing to every broken pipe and unrepaired road as proof that the negotiated settlement was a farce, that the old men from prison had swapped radicalism for red tape. "You stand in queues," Thabo told a crowd in a township stadium, "and what do you get? Old comrades in suits, riding in new German cars, while your roof still leaks." Now the rivalry had numbers, votes, budgets, crime statistics. It also had a new invisible weapon: time. If the new government failed to improve lives quickly, cynicism would spread faster than any leaflet. And cynicism, Raymond knew, could kill a democracy before it learned to walk. He began his days before dawn, often with a coughing fit that reminded him his body had paid its dues. Meetings rolled in relentless sequence, with engineers about water projects, with teachers about collapsing schools, with nurses about clinics where the line of patients never ended. He refused the more extravagant trappings of office. No flashy convoys, no grand gestures. He moved with the unhurried, stubborn step of a man who had learned that theatrical speed often hides real inaction. But the problems were so big, they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The bureaucracy he inherited was a maze of overlapping departments, ghost employees, and officials loyal to the old order. Files vanished, budgets disappeared. A road marked as completed in a report existed, in reality, as a line of dust and promises. Raymond did not shout in these meetings. He asked questions, again and again, until the excuses cracked. When he uncovered fraud, he moved to act, suspend, investigate, replace. Each time he did, he made new enemies, some with roots deeper in the province's political soil than his own. More than once, a quiet warning reached him. "You're going to make this government ungovernable if you chase every crook." His reply was as simple as it was dangerous. "If we don't chase them, we are not a different government." Yet there were victories, small and astonishing, that never reached international headlines. Villages that had never seen running water watched as pipes were laid and taps sputtered to life, children shrieking and dancing in the spray. Mud schools were replaced, plank by plank, with brick buildings painted bright colors so that they would stand out against the monotony of dust. In one rural area, where candles had been the only source of light for generations, electricity came, first as a rumor, then as poles on the horizon, then as a flicker, then as a steady glow that made old women weep as if greeting a long-lost relative. These changes did not erase centuries of theft. They did, however, carve a new line in people's imaginations, the state as something that could give, not only take. But the clock would not slow down. Scandals, some genuine and some exaggerated by rivals, assaulted the new provincial government. Delays in teacher salaries, allegations of mismanaged funds. Newspapers that yesterday praised liberation now published cartoons of aging revolutionaries drowning in paperwork. Thabo did not need to invent grievances. He simply pointed to them. In smoky township bars, the talk turned sour. "Is this what we voted for? A different flag and the same hunger?" Raymond carried those questions like stones in his pockets. When he lay awake at night, listening to the thin noises of the city outside the official residence, his mind returned to the same nightmare, not of prison, but of a traffic circle where history spun in place, where apartheid's collapse had led not to freedom, but to a new form of abandonment. His health began to strain under the load. Doctors whispered about blood pressure, about stress. Friends reminded him of his age, of the years already carved out of him by prison and exile inside his own country. Then came the twist that shocked many who knew him only as a fighter who never stepped back. Barely 3 years into his term as premier, he stepped down. Officially, he cited age and the need for fresh leadership. Unofficially, he knew something harder, that the province needed someone who could run at a pace his body could no longer sustain, and that he could serve the country better in a different role than by clinging to an office he had fought most of his life to make possible. To some, it looked like defeat. Thabo and his circle whispered that the old guard was crumbling, that men like Raymond had proved finally that they were better at resistance than at governance. But he was already looking at a wider horizon. The new democratic South Africa was not an island. Beyond its borders, other nations were drowning in blood. Mozambique, piecing itself together after years of war. Angola, still pulled apart, and most brutally of all, Rwanda. In 1994, while South Africans voted, almost 1 million people were slaughtered in Rwanda in 100 days. Neighbors hacked neighbors to death with machetes. Churches became slaughterhouses. Radio stations encouraged murder on air. The world watched, horrified, and mostly did nothing. Years later, when Raymond accepted the post of High Commissioner to Uganda and non-resident ambassador to Rwanda, it was more than a diplomatic appointment. It was a journey straight into the nightmare his own country had barely avoided. He walked through Kigali's streets, still heavy with ghosts. He visited memorials where skulls were stacked in glass cases and children's clothes hung as if waiting for bodies that would never return. He listened to survivors whose entire families had been erased in a single night. In those spaces, the arguments he'd had back home about whether South Africa had compromised too much, whether reconciliation was weakness, took on a terrifying clarity. This is what happens, he thought, when a country jumps from oppression to revenge without passing through justice. This is what no talks with killers can look like when taken to its final conclusion. In meeting rooms with Rwandan officials, Ugandan leaders, international diplomats, he spoke not as a polished career ambassador, but as a man who had seen 2 possible futures, one built on ballots and fragile forgiveness, another written in mass graves. He carried South Africa's messy, incomplete miracle into those conversations like a living argument. Back home, his name appeared less frequently in the headlines. New leaders, new scandals, new struggles filled the front pages. The rivalry with Thabo, once so sharp it felt like a personal wound, faded into the broader noise of a democracy discovering that opposition was no longer treason, but profession. Yet even at a distance, Raymond kept watching his country with the same unblinking attention he'd once given to whispers in prison, corridors, and movement in the guard towers. The race against time had changed shape again. It was no longer about surviving a trial, or crossing the sea to Robben Island, or reaching an election before the country exploded. It was about something more subtle, and in some ways, even harder, proving, year after year, that the choice for negotiation over civil war, for ballots over bullets, had not been a historic fluke, but a sustainable way of living. His own time was running down. Age does not bargain. But as he moved through airports and embassies, through conference halls and quiet hotel rooms, one question pressed on him with growing intensity. When the story of this freedom is told, will people remember only the moment the chains fell, or will they also see the long, exhausting work that came after, the compromises, the rivalries, the near misses with disaster that kept the whole experiment alive? It was a question that the final years of his life, and the way his country chose to honor or forget him, would answer. The revolution did not end with a gunshot or a signature. For Raymond Mhlaba, it ended under fluorescent hospital lights, with a doctor pointing at a shadow on a scan and saying, in a careful, rehearsed voice, "Mr. Mhlaba, we need to talk about how much time you have left." He had outlived a death sentence, outlived a life sentence, outlived a regime. Now, for the first time, he faced an enemy that did not care about manifestos or negotiations. Cells were multiplying in his liver with the same cold determination the apartheid state had once shown. Only this time, there would be no trial, no appeal, no Robben Island to survive and turn into legend. The clock that had always ticked quietly in the background of his life suddenly grew louder. Months. The word hung in the air, heavier than years had ever been in a courtroom. He walked out of the consultation room into a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Nurses passed, pushing trolleys, eyes tired. Families clustered on plastic chairs, holding plastic bags with fruit and faith. This, he thought, is the country I helped build. A place where there are no more whites-only wards, where black nurses wear uniforms, with authority instead of domestic aprons, and yet where people still wait for hours to hear if they will live or die. Freedom had changed the script. It hadn't changed the ending. His diplomatic years had already taught him how fragile the line between peace and slaughter could be. In Kigali, he had stood before glass cases filled with skulls that looked no different from his comrades' skulls on Robben Island, except for the fractures made by machetes instead of batons. In Uganda, he had watched a generation of young officers swagger in uniform, some dreaming of reform, others dreaming of power for its own sake. Everywhere he went, leaders invoked words he knew too well: liberation, reconstruction, reconciliation. And everywhere, the same question lurked. After the enemy is defeated, who becomes the new enemy? Poverty, corruption, memory? When he finally returned to South Africa for good, he stepped back into a country that was older and younger at the same time. Older because the early euphoria of 1994 had settled into the routines of governance: traffic jams, talk radio complaints, tax forms, parliamentary debates watched with half an ear over dinner. Younger because millions of children now filled classrooms that would once have rejected them, reciting a national anthem that stitched together languages that had once been used as weapons. He was no longer premier, no longer ambassador. Official titles slid away, one by one, like layers of clothing after a long day. What remained was something harder to describe and harder to manage. He was now an elder. It sounded ceremonial. It wasn't. Being an elder meant being summoned whenever the foundations trembled. A strike that threatened to turn violent, a fight between factions. In an ANC branch, a scandal involving someone who swore they had grown up inspired by his generation and then somehow lost their way near a tender document. It also meant facing an unexpected humiliation: invisibility. He would sit in waiting rooms outside radio studios, listening to younger activists give interviews about the betrayal of the revolution, and notice that the receptionist had no idea the quiet man in the corner had once faced life imprisonment for that same revolution. In some township streets, walls were covered with new faces, new slogans. His generation's heroes were still on posters, but many were fading, colors washed out by sun and rain. The rivalry with Thabo, the man who had once turned street corners into battlegrounds of words, did not disappear in this new landscape. It mutated. Thabo's radical movement had never won national power, but it had won something almost as potent: permanent outrage. Its leaders filled halls and social media feeds with a relentless drumbeat of accusation. Every failure of service delivery, every corruption headline, every photograph of an ANC councillor's shiny car outside a collapsing Shack settlement became part of one long indictment. They compromised our future at that negotiation table, Thabo told a crowd at a university one evening, his voice broadcast later across campuses and phones. They shook hands with our oppressors. They chose peace over justice. And now we live with the consequences. A democracy that feeds the connected and starves the poor. He did not have to say Raymond's name. The implication hovered between the words. Students cheered. Some wore T-shirts with stylized images of figures from the 1976 generation, fists raised, eyes burning. To many of them, 1963 might as well have been 1863. Rivonia was a word from a textbook, not a memory. When Raymond watched the recording of that speech on a television in his modest lounge, the harsh light flattening Thabo's features, he felt a familiar mix of irritation and grim understanding. He had been that voice once, demanding everything, refusing half measures, but he had grown old in the gap between demand and possible. Now the gap was filling with something dangerous. Impatience. The news did not help. Stories of tenders awarded to friends, of officials building mansions on salaries that should barely afford a family house, of comrades who had once shared smuggled bread in prison, now sharing seats on corporate boards. They stung. He had no interest in pretending that everything was fine. It wasn't. The twist came on a winter afternoon when the ANC regional office in Port Elizabeth called and asked, almost sheepishly, if he would be willing to appear in a televised debate. You and Thabo, the organizer said, side by side, about the future of the revolution. It sounded like a cruel joke. He coughed. The same dry cough the doctors were tracking with growing concern. You think people want to watch two old men argue about the past? They're not old, Tata, the organizer said. He's not as old as you, at least. And the students, the youth, they listen to him. We need them to hear you too. Just once before. The word they did not say. A date was set. A venue, a university auditorium, high-ceilinged, with bad acoustics and excellent cameras. The countdown, this time, was not to an election, but to a confrontation that might be his last chance to explain, in plain language, why he had done what he had done, and why the path of negotiated freedom, messy and compromised as it was, had been chosen over the path of cleansing fire. The morning of the debate, he dressed as if for court. Careful, measured, no flashy suit, just a well-pressed one. No designer tie, just a solid knot. Outside, the wind coming off the ocean had teeth. His body felt heavier than it once had after years in the quarry. But his mind was clear. Backstage, the air hummed with equipment and nerves. Thabo stood under a spotlight being adjusted, talking to a young journalist, laughing easily. His hair was thinner now, his sharpness undimmed. When their eyes met, neither of them smiled. You're still chasing cameras, Raymond said, his tone dry. You're still chasing compromises, Thabo replied. Let's see who people are more tired of. The moderator introduced them with reverence, using words like legend, icon, stalwart for Raymond, and firebrand, voice of the disillusioned, for Thabo. The labels hung in the air like weapons and shields. At first, the debate played out as expected. Thabo attacked the settlement of the early 1990s as a historic surrender. We traded one set of masters for another, he said, leaning forward, voice low and intense. How else do you explain the fact that 10 years after democracy, we still have children learning under trees, while companies that fed off apartheid now sponsor our political campaigns? The students applauded. Some shouted, "Tell them!" Phones glowed in the dim light as clips were recorded, ready to be sliced and shared. When it was his turn, Raymond did not raise his voice. "I will not defend corruption," he began. "If you steal from your own people, I do not care what colors you wore in the struggle. You are a criminal." The room shifted. Some looked startled. They had expected excuses. But he continued. I will not lie to you about the war you think we should have fought. Instead, you speak of revolution as if it is a photograph, heroic, clear, frozen in time. I have seen revolution as moving pictures. I have seen men dying slowly in cells because there were not enough weapons. I have walked in Rwanda and seen what happens when revenge becomes policy. He described in painful detail a church he had visited in Kigali where the pews were still stained dark, where shoes lay where their owners had fallen. He described the smell, the silence. That, he said softly, is what no compromise can look like. It was not the argument he had made 100 times in meetings behind closed doors. It was raw, stripped of slogans. For a moment, the hall was quiet enough to hear the hum of the lights. Then Thabo struck back, not with theory, but with something more personal. If the settlement was so necessary, he asked, why do so many of our people still live in shacks? Why do comrades who once shared cells now share champagne with the same businessmen who funded our oppression? Don't tell me about Rwanda to justify our leaders' greed. It was a blow that hit not just him, but his entire generation. The twist came from somewhere he had not expected. The students themselves. A young woman stood up during the question session, her hand shaking slightly, not with fear, but with urgency. My mother still washes clothes for a living, she said, looking from Thabo to Raymond and back. We are still poor. But I am at this university because there are bursaries now that did not exist then. My uncle died in the struggle. He always spoke your name, Tata, with respect. He also said, when freedom comes, it won't be perfect. She turned to Thabo. I am angry, she said. I am tired. But when you talk, it sounds like you want to burn everything down to prove that the first fire was not hot enough. If we do that, who will rebuild it? You? Laughter rippled, then died down. Raymond watched this new generation with something like cautious hope. They were not naive. They saw the betrayals, but they were also wary of those who offered simple answers to complex disasters. The debate ended not with a knockout punch, but with something messier, a shared, uncomfortable recognition that the line between visionary and arsonist could be thin, and that history would not hand out clean certificates of victory or guilt. Afterwards, backstage, Thabo approached him. For a moment, the decades fell away, and they were again two young men arguing over pamphlets in a cramped, safe house. You played the Rwanda card well, Thabo said. You always were good with images. It's not a card, Raymond replied. It's a graveyard. They stood in silence. You know they will edit this, Thabo said at last. Cut it into little pieces. Use your words or mine, depending on who is watching. Of course, Raymond said. But some things stay. Even when you cut, the bones stay. He did not see Thabo again after that. The months that followed were measured in medical appointments and slow, stubborn work. He continued to visit branches, to attend Veterans League meetings, to write letters of support or rebuke when asked. He pushed for younger, cleaner leaders to be promoted in the Eastern Cape, arguing that the struggle's credibility depended on more than history. It depended on how they governed now. His body, however, kept its own agenda. The cough deepened. Fatigue settled into him like wet sand. Some days, getting out of bed felt like climbing the quarry slope backwards. Friends urged him to rest, to enjoy retirement, as if his life had ever been a job you clocked out of. He smiled and said he would slow down. He lied. The last twist in his story did not come in a parliament or a courtroom, but in a quieter place. One evening, a young man arrived at his house, nervously smoothing the front of his shirt. He introduced himself as a filmmaker, working on a documentary about the early years of the Eastern Cape government. I know you don't like cameras, the young man said, but I think it's important that people hear from you directly, not from textbooks, not from politicians using your name, from you. Raymond hesitated. Cameras froze time in ways he did not trust. They turned long, complicated struggles into sound bites and dramatic zooms. "How long would it take?" he asked. "A few hours," the filmmaker said. The doctor's voice echoed in his memory. "Months," he agreed. They filmed in his living room, the curtains half open to let in the late afternoon light. The camera whirred quietly. The young man asked about Robben Island, about Mandela, about the first days in the premier's office when the phones didn't work, and the budget looked like an insult. Then, unexpectedly, the filmmaker asked, "What are you most afraid of, Tata?" He had been asked about fear before: fear of torture, fear of hanging, fear of failure in negotiations. This time, he answered differently. "I am afraid," he said slowly, "that people will remember only our suffering and not our choices. It is easy to say, they were brave, they went to prison. It is harder to understand why, when the chance came to burn everything, we instead chose to sit in rooms with men we hated and find a way to avoid a second graveyard." He paused, catching his breath. "And I am afraid," he added, "that some of our comrades have forgotten that we did not go to prison to become rich. We went so that a child born in a shack would have a better chance than we did. If that child looks at us now and sees only new suits and old excuses, then we have betrayed something that cannot be repaired." The camera captured the lines on his face as he spoke, the mixture of steel and sadness in his eyes. When the crew left, he sat for a long time, in the quiet, listening to the distant noise of cars, the occasional shout of children playing in the street. Life, indifferent and relentless, went on. In February 2005, the final deadline arrived. He fell ill enough to be admitted to a hospital in Port Elizabeth, the same city whose streets he had once walked as a young organizer. Dodging special branch cars and passing leaflets hand to hand, now he lay in a bed, machines marking his heartbeat with steady beeps. Comrades came to visit, some old, faces creased with the same years that had carved his, some younger, nervous, not sure how to speak, to a man whose name they had learned in struggle songs. They spoke of politics, of factional battles, of upcoming conferences. He listened, occasionally interjecting, his voice softer but still carrying that old insistence. "Don't forget why we started." News of his condition spread quietly. For a brief moment, headlines carried his name again. Radio stations replayed old interviews. Commentators spoke solemnly of sacrifice, of integrity, of a generation we are losing. On 20th February 2005, at the age of 85, Raymond Mhlaba died. There were no tanks in the streets, no sirens wailing for a fallen head of state. The country did not stop. Taxis hooted. Miners went underground. Shoppers argued over prices in supermarkets. Football fans shouted at televisions. In a small house somewhere, a child was born who would grow up with no memory of the man whose quiet persistence had helped make their birth certificate a right, not a favor. At his funeral, flags flew at half-mast. Speakers talked of courage, of humility, of unwavering commitment. Nelson Mandela, frailer now, spoke of him as a soldier of peace. Old Robben Island prisoners embraced, sharing stories of the man who had kept calm in the worst storms, who had argued fiercely about strategy, and then shared his last cigarette without hesitation. Outside the funeral tent, a group of young people huddled around a phone, watching a clip from that debate months earlier. The moment when he spoke about the church in Kigali, the moment when his voice, cracked but unflinching, drew a line between revenge and justice. "Yo," one of them said quietly, "this old man, he went through stuff." Another shrugged, uncomfortable with reverence. "All of them did. But look at the country now, man. Crime, corruption." A third, the young woman from the debate, shook her head. "It's not that simple," she said. "We're here because they made choices under pressure we can't even imagine. Our choices now They're our responsibility. In the years that followed, his name would surface and sink. As all names do, a street would be renamed after him in one city, a school in another. A hospital ward would bear his portrait, patients rolling past without always knowing who he was. History textbooks would devote a page or two to his role in Rivonia, in the Eastern Cape, in diplomacy. But his real legacy lived in places without plaques. In the village where the first electric light bulb had flickered on during his premiership, children now did their homework under a steady glow instead of a candle's weak flame. In a township school that had once been a mud structure and was now brick, a teacher explained to a class what apartheid had been, while her students, bored and secure, struggled to imagine a world where they were not allowed in that classroom. In a diplomatic briefing in some other country teetering on the edge of catastrophe, a South African official would quietly invoke their own transition as evidence that it was possible, not inevitable, but possible, to step back from the cliff. And somewhere, in an archive, a recording would remain. An old man, in a dark suit, speaking about choices made with a gun to the country, his head and a clock ticking in the background. The rivalry in the end was not the one between him and Thabo, or between parties, or between generations. It was the rivalry between two visions of how to face injustice, destroy the house and build anew on the ashes, or negotiate room by painful room with those who had once held the keys. Raymond Mhlaba's life did not offer a neat answer. It offered something harder, an example of how to keep walking, slowly, stubbornly, in the narrow space between surrender and destruction. Knowing that time is short, that enemies are many, and that the verdict of history, when it finally arrives, will come not as applause or condemnation, but as the daily lives of people who may never learn your name.